You are now listening to The Sound of Sanity, Beyond the Wardrobe Edition. This is a special series of episodes wherein Nathan and Ben journey through the enchanted world of children's fantasy literature. What will this journey bring? You'll have to come with us to find out.
Hey everybody, welcome to Sound of Sanity. We're talking Wind in the Willows today, baby. A classic work of children's literature. I am Nathan, your humble and obedient host. That's Ben, the preacher who's a teacher of frog story. No, there's no frogs in this story, is there?
There's toads.
There's toads. A toad. Yeah, Frog and Toad by Arnold Lobel, one of my favorite children's book series as a young child. But we're talking about slightly more sophisticated books than that today. But if you need good picture books that are a little bit more complicated than Dr. Seuss, I highly recommend the works of Arnold Lobel. He also wrote Owl Soup and several Frog and Toad adventures. I guess they're pretty well known. I mean, you go to Barnes & Noble and you go into the children's section and you will see Frog climbing up a ladder. At least in our children's book, there's in our children's section at Barnes & Noble, there's a big frog from Frog. Were you a Frog and Toad man?
I remember liking them. Don't have a very clear memory. I can see the cover in my mind.
They underwent amusing adventures and learned lessons, and things happened. I don't know, like Frog got the idea he's going to surprise Toad by raking all Toad's leaves, and Toad gets the idea he's going to surprise Frog by raking all Frog's leaves. And so they both walk to each other's houses. They manage to miss each other. They rake each other's leaves. They both walk home and manage to miss each other. While they are walking home, the wind blows and destroys both leaf piles. They both get home and are very content that they did a good deed for the other person. That's a fairly typical Frog and Toad
That's fun.
adventure.
That's
yes,
sweet.
They're quite fun and sweet, and I highly recommend them. And speaking of things that I highly recommend, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I highly recommend Wind in the Willows. This might be my favorite thing that we've read so far this year. I liked it a lot. But let's talk about Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. It's got willows. It's got some wind, I guess.
It does.
Does the wind actually play much of a role in this thing?
Oh, the wind is always, rustling the wheat.
Yes.
Or something. And yes, absolutely.
He likes his pantheism or his nature worship.
Yeah, he does. Very much.
Well, let's talk about it. Kenneth Grahame, Ben, I think you've got some context for us.
I've got a little. I didn't find a ton of things, but he was a sad, tragic loner, which reminds me of Robert C. O'Brien. I don't think that Robert C. O'Brien wasn't as tragic, but Robert C. O'Brien was a loner, the writer of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, which is another very closely observed nature story about anthropomorphized animals.
Not half as anthropomorphized as these animals.
No, these are much more like these are people, basically, who are also animals.
Well, they're very fluid. Sometimes they'll be a little bit more animalish, and then sometimes they'll just be walking around in town. Or
that's right. Yeah, it's like they're in this weird borderland that he has no interest in defining exactly, but it lets him do both things.
Right.
Lets him talk both about the joys of civilization and the joys of nature. And this is unlike Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim. This is not a bleak, grim book about how every day by the river could be your last because something will eat you.
No,
not at all. So
there's a tiny bit of that feeling, but it's like 4% of that and then 96% of like an Edwardian comedy of manners.
I know. It's great. Well, okay, Kenneth Grahame himself did not have a happy life. So Kenneth Grahame was born 1859. He died in 1932. He's Scottish, and he had an unhappy childhood. His dad was a lawyer, but his dad was an alcoholic. And when he was 5, his mom died of scarlet fever. His dad couldn't handle it. He was like, you and your 3 siblings, you're going to live with your mom's mother. And so they did, and they lived in this big house in not great condition on the River Thames. And I think he loved that setting.
Okay.
And spent time by himself. And you can trace back his love of the natural world and his isolation. The same sense you get in The Wind in the Willows, which is that, there are many connections, but on the other hand, it's quite solitary. For all that Mole ends up spending most of the book with Rat. You don't feel like Mole, I don't know. There is a solitary feeling to the whole book.
Yes.
It's like you could go a long time without seeing anyone if you wanted. And if you did, you would see people at a certain frequency that wasn't too often, maybe. So that was his growing up life. And Graham grew up as a good student. He wanted to attend Oxford, but it cost too much. And so he went to work at the Bank of England, and he rose through the ranks, as Wikipedia puts it, till he retired as its secretary in 1908. And I don't know what position exactly secretary is. I didn't look it up, but it was a high position. It was an indication that you were really good. There was a weird incident that happened during his time at the bank where this guy came in, a guy named George Robinson, who was some kind of lunatic. He came in, he asked to speak to the head manager of the bank called the governor. They're like, the governor's tired, but do you want to see the bank's secretary? Yes, I want to see the bank's secretary. Kenneth Grahame comes out. This guy has a rolled up manuscript tied at one end with a black ribbon and at the other with a white ribbon, and asks Grahame which end he chooses. Grahame doesn't quite know what he's dealing with here. He ends up picking the black ribbon, at which point the man pulls out a gun and shoots at him 3 times, missing every time. Then he gets wrestled to the ground, and the fire brigade turns the hose on him, and this guy's committed to the insane asylum. So that was 1903. Grahame retired in 1908. It may have had some effect on his health. I don't know. In between that time, 9 years earlier, 1899, Grahame got married to a woman named Elspeth Thompson, and they did not have a happy marriage. They had only one son, was named Alistair, and he was born blind in one eye. He had other health problems, and Grahame began The Wind in the Willows as bedtime stories. I think I read somewhere that he also continued them in letters, maybe when Alistair was at boarding school. I'm not sure. Wind in the Willows came out in, 1908. So Alistair, I think would have been 7, 8 when that came out.
Okay.
But later on, when he was at college at age 19, Alistair killed himself by throwing himself in front of a train. So Grahame had just a weird, lonely life. He always loved nature, always carried that in his heart, and the intensity with which he loved it, I think, is just obvious if you read any part of Wind in the Willows, and the feeling, the deep feeling that he had for it. It's easy. Maybe it's not easy to notice, but man, I certainly noticed this time. The Wind in the Willows, no one has a wife.
Right.
You don't even really, maybe there's a reference to a mother at some point. You have some women characters, but mostly for comedic effect.
Right, yeah, it's just pretty aggressively, what would one say? Asexual almost? I mean,
it feels like bachelors doing as they please in the countryside. Gentlemen bachelors who have time and leisure and means to enjoy themselves and to romanticize and soliloquize about the lives that they lead and enjoy in their homes. But no moms, no wives, hardly even kids, although there's a few kids running around. So you feel like that's a pretty good reflection of Graham's own heart and orientation.
Right.
And there's not a lot else to say. I mean, he wrote some other books that that's not true. I've read the story The Reluctant Dragon, I'm almost certain. Or maybe I've just seen the Disney thing. Have you seen The Reluctant Dragon?
I've certainly seen the animated thing, and I
think I've read it.
I'm familiar with the story. I think I probably read it too.
I think I've read it. Yeah. I think I remember reading and enjoying it. I haven't read any of his other... I haven't read the entire book Dream Days, which The Reluctant Dragon is part of. I haven't read The Golden Age or The Pagan Papers, and maybe I will. Of all the people we've read, this guy's writing is the most like, oh, he might be a genius.
Yeah.
At least he's a poet. This guy's an amazing writer.
Yeah, for sure.
I wonder what his influence was on Tolkien in terms of the cadences of his prose and his love for natural description. Wonder if he had an influence on Tolkien.
Yeah,
How could he not, though?
Feels like it could have been high. It feels like he certainly had an influence on C.S. Lewis. This has all C.S. Lewis's favorite thing, paganism.
That's funny. Yes. Yeah. The sudden unexpected appearance of Pan.
Right.
God Pan. It does.
It's actually very Lewisian when that happens.
It feels very Lewisian. Very like a Narnia type of event.
Well, and just the feeling of transcendence that he connects to paganism is something that Lewis loved and used multiple times throughout his fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah. Well, the only other thing to say, I guess, is that Wind in the Willows was not a hit when it came out. It's not like some of the books Wizard of Oz, Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was such a massive hit.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of funny to think of that. But this book was not. It took a while. It took A.A. Milne creating a play called Mr. Toad of Toad Hall. Isn't that what it is? Toad of Toad Hall. Just Toad of Toad Hall. Which I know of the existence of this play. I don't think I've seen it, but I'd be curious. So anyway, people came back to this one. It became very popular. It became a classic, but it wasn't at first. I think his short stories were more popular in his lifetime. And that's about all there is.
Well, let's talk about our baggage. I barely remembered this book. I knew I had read and loved it as a young child. I knew I had seen not just the Disney version, but several adaptations of this. There's like a whole forgotten chunk of my life, almost like Pan himself erased it from my memory, his final gift. Well, that's actually not entirely facetious that I use that analogy, because it does feel like there's a magical part of my life that I'm not quite in touch with, that maybe I should be in touch with or lost touch with somewhere along the way, that included Wind in the Willows. Early on, I remember reading this book. I remember having it read to me. I remember the Disney movie. I remember a claymation movie, I think maybe 80s BBC-ish type thing. I feel like I've seen multiple adaptations. Like, I feel like there was a time when all of this was in my imaginative vocabulary and very present in my life, but I barely could have told you what it was about. I knew it was about Toad, and I knew it was called Wind in the Willows, and I had the idea that it was an idyllic early British kind of a thing, but I remembered very little about it. But as I read it, I had that joyous sense of rediscovery, like, oh, yeah. Oh, mole and rat, and I remember this. I didn't remember anything about some of the more esoteric. In fact, I wonder if that stuff was just skipped. I wonder if the Piper in the Gates of Dawn made it into my mom's rendition of this when she read it to us or not. But yeah, it was fun to go back to. And now that I have it again, I don't want to let it go. I think it's, in some ways, my favorite thing that we've done in this series so far. It's a wonderful book, but we'll get more into our actual take here in a second. What is your Wind in the Willows baggage?
I think I saw Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and then I think I didn't read this book as a kid, or I can't remember if I did. I think it just wasn't quite, I was all about adventure. It was all about the Redwall kind of thing, and this is not that. And I mean, it does have a little bit of daring do, but it's not focused on daring do.
I imagine that's why I didn't keep reading it after I lost touch with it. I imagine that's why I lost touch with it.
Right. It's a very different kind of book.
Yeah.
And maybe if I'd been a kid in some other era, I might have glommed onto it. But I enjoy it. I enjoyed it more as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
I did read it at some point. Maybe I was a teen. Maybe I was even in my 20s or 30s, is possible. I'm gonna guess 20s actually, and I was nonplussed. I think it's like, okay, well, it's charming and it's certainly well written, but it doesn't do much for me. And then you've got this weird Pan stuff in the middle, and okay, all right, I guess it's a thing.
Yeah.
So goodbye.
Yeah, I could understand that. I could see hitting it that way.
Yeah.
But let's talk about how we hit it this time. What'd you think about Wind in the Willows?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. One, it's great.
Agreed.
Certain chapters, at least, were my favorite thing that we've read in this series, Beyond the Wardrobe, so far. I was really taken by... I was able to get into the spirit of the thing this time, at least for the most part.
Yeah, I'm hit and miss on this era's like Edwardian whimsy. I had a spat of loving Jeeves and Wooster books back in the day. I haven't gone back to them, and I don't think that I'd want to. I still admire Woodhouse for his prose and stuff, but like some of the stuff that has written around this time, J.M. Barrie, there's certain things where I'm just like, it's a little overwrought or a little in love with itself or a little something. And Wind of the Willows constantly threatens to be all those things.
That's right.
But I like how down to earth it is and how dryly it presents itself. It's not striving for effect. It can be over the top with some of the nature stuff. But Mostly you have these very prosaic English stereotype characters, well drawn with very fun human foibles. I mean, our foursome, mole, rat, badger, and toad, are all great in their own individual ways and all very well drawn and more three-dimensional than you expect each one of them.
Yeah.
So I found the characters delightful and I found the world delightful. And go on. I think I jumped in there.
No, that's all right. I found the world really delightful. I loved the first half of the book where Rat is helping Mole acclimate to the broader world. Deal with, there's not just my hole in the ground, there's the river. And then off somewhere there's the wild wood. I'll go into the wild wood. Oh no, that was a terrible idea. I'm terrified, So Mole is just getting introduced to all these things and having a great time doing it. And then I think probably the most charming thing for me, the thing that made me happiest, was Rat and Mole's friendship. Rat is a really great friend.
Yeah.
Like, it made me think, I don't know that I'm as good a friend to anyone as Rat is to Mole. He's certainly a more patient sort of person, Rat, than I am. But he's also just generous. He's just generous. And there is a nice reminder in there of what friendship can be or ought to be.
Yeah.
There's just a generosity of spirit that the animals have for each other, at least our foursome. That's really sweet. And for all that it may have come from, for all the sadness of marking, wait a minute, where are the female characters? And then learning a little bit about Graham's life and then processing it that way, there's still a lot he captures about good friendships. And so just the gentle adventure, comedy, the immersive description, the completely immersive description about home and then exploring far from home and then being excited by a new place like the Wildwood and then realizing, wait a minute, now I'm terrified. I don't know how to deal with this. It is like, in some ways, it is like being a kid again.
Yeah.
And it gives you some of the, because I was struggling to put my finger on it. So this book is a weird mixture because it's these adult males, basically, like young bachelors,
right,
like I said. But then Mole is like a kid. He's like a little kid. It's as though the way that he experiences the world is the way that you or I as a boy experience things. Like suddenly our horizons were broadened and we were amazed at the forest. And then we got lost from our dad and mom who we were hiking with. And then we were like alone in the forest for 5 minutes and we were terrified. We felt the vastness and craziness of the wilderness or something, as a little kid would. And then your mom and dad find you and you're like, oh, you're okay. But you never forget those 5 minutes of being lost in the woods as you felt you were. And so every experience gets magnified. And it's like he's, I don't have a better word, unfortunately. It's like he's milking it. He's milking these childhood moments. And they're the main things that the plot turns on in some sense.
It reminded me a lot of The Hobbit in that sense. Obviously, The Hobbit is much more plot-based and sort of high episodes of high adventure and a journey that you can track that's singular. But the alternating sort of danger that's just dangerous enough without being too dangerous, like the way a kid perceives danger, like, oh, that was really scary, but now it's over. The coziness of home and hearth and friendship and the sense of we're just going to sit on the porch and smoke our pipes together while the autumnal wind blows through the willows. And then there's another thing that's very Tolkienian, which is the like you were saying, the male bonding aspect and the kind of natural hierarchies that develop through generosity of spirit and friendship on the one hand, and then through age and wisdom and experience versus naivete and immaturity on the other hand. So I think Gandalf lovers will recognize a little bit of his DNA in Badger, the kind of the stolid older gentleman who morally approves or disapproves of everyone, and he's a little bit grouchy and you can never quite predict what he's going to approve of or not approve of, but he's the moral arbiter of things. And then the complete generosity bordering on unwise sometimes of Rat, but mostly very commendable. And then of course as kids everybody loves Toad. That was probably the thing I was least interested in this particular the more sort of slapstick adventures of Mr. Toad. Not that I don't want to sneer. I understand why. Disney would zero in on that, and why kids zero in on that, why people think of these books from the very beginning as the Mr. Toad stories.
Right.
But they're this book, I should say, not these books.
Right.
But, even you can see it in Milne's adaptation, Toad of Toad Hall, like everybody. When you read the book, what's striking about it is that it's about 4 creatures, not just about Toad. And it's not, I wouldn't even say he's the protagonist, really. But any adaptation always makes it into the Toad story because he's got the most kind of fun and the most splashy arc in terms of...
Pun intended.
Yes, indeed. But it's just as good as a mole protagonist story. In fact, I think it's more successful when viewed that way.
I think structurally it's weird because it starts as a mole protagonist story.
Yeah.
You have a bit of an interlude with Rat.
Yeah.
And then you have It's All Toad.
Yeah.
The rest of the time. With everyone still around.
Right.
But that's its structure. I found myself, I don't know if you listened to it yourself or just read it. I listened to it.
Yeah.
My reader was really funny. So the way that he did Toad, especially, was perfect.
Did you do the one that Terry Jones read?
No, I could not get a hold of that one. It was checked out already, probably by some jerk that I know. No, I'm just kidding. So I think that was on Libby.
I'm just trying to think what jerks you know.
I don't. It's a mystery.
Do you know jerks?
It's a mystery.
Why do you spend time with these people?
It's a very good question. I think that one had limited copies. It was on Libby. So I found one on Hoopla, read by another British gentleman, and boy, he did a great job. So Toad, I was cracking up most of the time, or a lot of the time, because I thought Toad was hilarious. So I had a great time with Toad.
Yeah, Terry Jones did a nice job too. I mean, he did.
I'm sure he did.
He did what you'd expect. Badger was very this way,
Yes.
And then Toad was very, that.
Yes, absolutely.
And then Mole was a little bit more this and.
It sounds like our authors did the same thing, but who's the reader on this one? This is surely it's going to be funny if this was actually Terry Jones, but no way. Yeah, Andrew Wincott. It didn't sound like Terry Jones. So no, it was really funny. Toad made me crack up, especially his refusal to reform at first when Badger puts him in a room and makes him cry, and then he brings him out and he says, no, absolutely not.
Yeah, to be clear, the Toad stuff is great, and Kenneth Grahame's moral sense and just the fun of the moral sense of a different era and a different place and a different, like the Edwardian sort of virtue of good manners, good breeding, noblesse oblige. Those things are all in there in a way that's very foreign to me and to, I think, most Americans of the 21st century. And so the idea that the 3 friends are just going to lock Toad in his house until he reforms, because he owes it to them, he owes it to society, he owes it to his village, he owes it to the good name of Toad. There's this whole Edwardian sense of morality that I dare say we could stand to learn a little something from, even if Kenneth Grahame is a weird guy and something of a pantheist. It's this book. It's nice to read a book from a different era, and it'll have sins that aren't our sins and virtues that aren't our virtues. And this book definitely has virtues that aren't our virtues.
Yeah, that's pretty nice.
But so when I say the Toad stuff was the least successful for me, I just mean
it was overshadowed.
I knew it was there, and I was waiting for it, and I thought the whole book was going to be it, and so I was pleasantly surprised to realize and remember there's a lot more going on.
There's a lot more
than Toad.
Yeah.
So
I would say my favorite is Mole and Rat stuff.
Yeah, the Mole and Rat stuff for sure, and there's just. It's one of those books where you don't get bored when it has the descriptions of the wind rustling through the willows. You do feel cozy when you're in Badger's house, when they're snowed in the wild woods and stuff like that. I mean, it has that snugly hidden away from the world inside a grand old house somewhere feeling that I always loved as a kid and I love now. And so a lot of that stuff's just great. I mean, it put me in touch with something that I always loved about Tolkien and others, but Tolkien's maybe the prime example that most people will know, which is that it wasn't particularly plot driven. You watch a Peter Jackson movie and you're like, oh yeah, of course Tolkien's full of plot and incident, but actually Tolkien's about leisurely journeys and resting and what they ate and what they saw.
Well, especially the first few chapters of Lord of the Rings, you're like, what's happening? Like this, we're just hanging out with friends for chapter after chapter here.
Right.
Page after page.
That's actually some of my favorites.
It's great.
even
It's
as
wonderful.
a kid, I began to lose interest in Lord of the Rings in Return of the King when everything was just moving so fast that you never really felt like you could just like stop and like you actually wanted to smell the flowers. Not that there were that many growing in Mordor, but it's like the Gondor battle goes so fast. There's everything becomes so sort of high and arcane, and it's moving so quickly, and so it's got its own kind of power. But just Frodo under the stars with his friends, you know, looking up at the weird kind of eldritch constellations of Middle Earth and wondering about them, or some of the creepy early stuff like the Barrow Wights or even, I dare say, Tom Bombadil, although he's never been my favorite. Some of that stuff's great, and it has its own kind of pull and its own kind of mystic power, and you can see a lot of, I keep using this phrase, but you can see a lot of the DNA of that in a Kenneth Grahame. Like, actually, when you like the characters, when you're invested in the relationships, when you just enjoy the humor and the way that and when you like spending time with the author, when you like his voice, you want a book to slow down sometimes. You don't just want everything to be built around narrative momentum.
Right.
You want to know what they ate. You want to know what they smoked. You want to know how the river was when they went on it. And not every book has to be built around a plot. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of this book, to the point where when the plot proper began to kick in with Toad being sentenced to 20 years in jail. I was less patient with that than I was with the other stuff. But obviously that was great. And the portrait of Toad and his escape and all that was a lot of fun.
Oh, man.
Although I did feel a little bit of pedanticness over what's the relationship between animals and humans in this world. And,
Yeah, I felt that too. It was hard to define.
if Toad's just a human, basically, then shouldn't the law still come after him? After like, why is he just like off scot-free now? But Kenneth Grahame doesn't care, and we're not supposed to care either. I mean, there's even things like, I think generations have been bugged by this. Toad combs his hair, and it's like, well, what are you actually supposed to imagine? I can imagine the way that Disney does that, because I remember Disney doing that. But it's like, what Kenneth Grahame sometimes does, as we said, want them to just be animals, and then in other places he wants them to be human and everything but name. What else is there to say about this book?
Oh, let's talk about romanticism and paganism, maybe in that order. So talk about romanticism, meaning the idea of finding something transcendent in the natural world, finding something sublime there, and being united with it, letting it pulse through you. This book, I think my unease when I first started listening to the book was tied to that. Like, I don't know that I will go with you here, Kenneth Grahame, into these reveries and transports about nature and its beauty and how it makes you feel and how it calls you. And I still feel some unease. Like, this book is about being put under a spell, both by, it's like all its characters are, okay, I'm finding this hard to talk about. So it's about the joys of home in being around your hearth, having friends, having supper. There's an intense scene in the middle of the book where Mole's old home that he forsook, calls to him, and he just has to go there, and he like sobs and sobs and sobs. And it's like, maybe I don't value my home enough, but there's something weird about this. Maybe it's just that it is a child crying for his home. It's not a man or a woman crying for their home. And maybe I'm unfair, and maybe that just shows that I'm not entirely whole as a man, that I feel that way. But I just felt like, well, I guess so. But I'm not going to try to cultivate Mole's feeling about his home in myself or in my kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something, I think it is maybe the virtue and the vice of a different time and a different place. But I think there is something virtuous about it. You can see it in Tolkien, in the Shire, in his love of the Shire, in his disgust at the scouring of the Shire, in Bilbo getting back to Bag End and having to reclaim his possessions. Like, the investment that Tolkien has and that his protagonist has in this place that's home is not one that I really share with the character. I'm always eager to get out of the Shire and get to the good stuff. And so is Peter Jackson. And Peter Jackson in those movies sentimentalizes the Shire in a way that shows he has no understanding of it. He's just like, it's cute, and everybody's a comic relief character wearing a silly wig
Yeah.
while Howard Shore goes overdrive on the music to tell you how bucolic everything is. And it kind of works. I don't want to sneer too much at it, but we don't have any conception of just the sort of robust love and loyalty that that these people have
I think you're
to their homes.
Sorry for interrupting. Yes, I think you're right. You see it also in Chesterton.
Yes, absolutely.
With that book, The Napoleon of Notting Hill.
Yeah.
If you, dear listener, have read that book, a little more obscure than most, you'd have been more likely to read The Man Who Was Sunday, I bet.
Mm-hmm.
But The Napoleon of Notting Hill, if memory serves, is about defending, loving your own neighborhood and being very particular about it. And there is, definitely, I remember as a kid, feeling the way that Tolkien felt about the Shire. I remember that Tolkien passed that feeling on to me more easily than Kenneth Grahame did. I think that would be true. I think kid Ben was just more tapped into what Tolkien was doing, partly because you had a quest story built in around it. And so maybe it's not true that I can't resonate with some of what Grahame does. But there's something about it that made me uncomfortable. And I really think that maybe just a sign there's something wrong with me, like I don't value.
I think I
don't know, though.
I think with me, like I think it's a flaw in me. I think I cannot enter into Tolkien's love of the Shire in the way, like, we could talk in a minute with what's wrong with Kenneth Grahame, and there are things, and there may even be something wrong with Tolkien, but I have very little attachment to things and to places, and almost, in my case, a borderline cynicism about them. Like, I want to be above it all. I don't want to care about, it's very easy for me to throw out a material possession, whereas my wife clings on to stuff and invests stuff with meaning and memory and has loyalty. Like, I can't throw that away. X, Y, or Z gave that to me and it has this memory. My brain doesn't operate that way. My heart doesn't operate that way. And I think some of that's probably pride. Some of that is brokenness from not enjoying my home at a young and early age in the way that I should have. I think there's a lot that goes into that. That some of it might just also be temperament. Like, I'm just not, I think for both of us, we actually love fantasy and story. Like, I think you and I, in a sense, both live in our heads a little bit more than some people. And so it's like we can carry our home with us in a way that another person invests the external world with their homely qualities.
Well, yeah, Nathan, as we've been talking, I'm now, this conversation is sparking some thoughts in me. And I'm thinking I didn't finish processing this discomfort before we talked. But I'm realizing, I just wasn't thinking of this, but I'm realizing the way that since I was a kid, have obsessed over home, especially over specific people and places. They didn't even have to be places where I lived, but like I have a lot of family and history in Mississippi and south of Jackson. In the neighborhood where my grandparents lived and where I had lots of cousins.
Right.
Has been a big part of my memories, even of dreams in some sense. And I think as a kid, I had a very strong feeling of attachment to the history that place and those times with family members represented to me. It's like my identity felt bound up with that in large part. And then I can think of a number of places I've lived, from Louisiana to Washington to Tennessee, where I felt some of that. Just that, and I can remember as a kid chewing on memories of people and places that had become a part of me in a way that was obsessive, sentimental, probably some degree of health, some degree of unhealth. It's hard for me to tell you what's what, but I said I couldn't identify with moles longing for home. And I'm thinking, actually, no, that's not true. You've done that a million times, maybe not so much as a married man. But on the other hand, there are still places and people that I have a strong feeling of attachment towards in some sense.
Yeah.
That are a part of my past. Life has moved on. I live here. I'm rooted here, and I want to be rooted here. But anyway, I just think maybe for some reason, I didn't connect what Grahame was doing with what I myself have done.
I think it's helpful to actually have you say all that, because I think we all have complex relationships with this sort of thing. Like, as you talk, I'm thinking, actually, there's places I have gone back to or could go back to where I would have a very mole-like experience where I'm like, I forgot all about this.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking about this, but actually it does have great meaning for me, but it's just not a meaning that I've let myself feel or have conjured up for a long time. But sometimes it'll hit me. I also think it's true that for me, as I've been married, as I've been a homeowner, as I've put down more real roots, I have more of a feeling of that sort of thing now in some ways than I ever did before. And maybe it's just like I'm paying a mortgage. So of course I'm going to have to invest some kind of sentimental meaning to my house.
And your children walk the hallways of your house now.
Yeah, exactly.
And your wife.
Exactly.
That's very different. I think that's true too. And I'm going to bet that I have more feeling there than I even realize. Speaking of my home, just like you do with yours.
What I don't have that Chesterton, Tolkien, and Grahame all seem to have, and that I understand, I can see the virtue in, sort of, but I just don't feel it, is this kind of, it might suck, but it's mine, and therefore I love it sort of feeling. Like, I don't have that. Like, to me, of course I'd rather be in Rat's House than Mole's Hole, because Rat's House is cool and Mole's Hole sucks. And it doesn't matter if I'm Mole and I own Mole's. Like, there's that kind of like, I'd rather have my crummy walking stick, to take something that they would have had, than a cool walking stick. And that's a kind of sentimental attachment that I do not relate to and have very little of, I think of. Like, I am, in some sense, I'm a pragmatist in a way that none of these men are, and in this a way that early 20th century British people don't seem to have been. Like when Chesterton's like, I like my walking stick because I can do 10 things with it, whereas now y'all have 10 different inventions that have replaced it. Is that really progress? I'm like, yeah, it's progress, Chesterton. Like, it's nice that we have air conditioning, and like, I'm just, there's something in all this that I don't relate to, and maybe even resent a little bit. Like, just the sort of Luddite feeling of it all, or that's not quite the right word, but
I think
that's not fair. But
I don't know. I bet that you do have some of the same attachment. It's just like, to go back to the Mole's Hole example, if you think of the things that make your house feel like home and that you and your wife have put together, she got this picture and you hung it up, or even small things like that. There's probably ways in which you're like, yeah, that's great. And if we gave all of it up for a bigger house that I was like, objectively, this is a nicer house or something, I'd probably feel some like, I miss the coziness of what we built and lived in.
Yeah, and I think I'm actually less that way, I think.
Okay.
I think you might even be more, I think at a certain point I'd be like, okay, let's talk numbers here. Like,
okay.
If you can make this other house cool enough, big enough, expensive enough, useful enough, whatever, then at a certain point that's going to outweigh whatever little sentiment I have.
I'll be happy to forget about everything we ever did at
Goodbye,
the other house.
Picture I hung with my own hands.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right.
Hello,
all right,
gold-plated faucets.
That's right. That's funny.
I mean, it's not like I would want to abandon all that for just one step up, but for 10 steps up, sure. Let's.
All right. Yeah, I get it.
So that, yeah. What would you even categorize that as? The romance of home, the bucolic feeling,
I'm not really
yearning.
sure how to talk about it without being totally abstract.
Yeah.
I don't know how.
Well, this book also has the classic romanticism of nature, which I think is actually pretty well evoked. And I don't feel particularly threatened by, like, I could see the wrong sort of person reading this book and taking the wrong lessons away from it. There is a strain of something that's bad in here, a strain of something that's borderline pantheistic, as I've said a couple times. But I mostly like it. I mean, it does get into straight paganism, which people need to realize, historically speaking, Grahame was writing in a time when there was a strain of neopaganism moving through the world. Lewis is downstream of that, and Lewis loves that stuff. And I'm not saying you can't read Lewis and love Lewis. I'm just saying he loves that stuff. I mean, you have the rise of all these weird religions, neo-pagan type religions in the early 20th century. I'm thinking of the horror writers of the time. Algernon Blackwood wrote The Willows, which is probably the best scary story ever written. It's all about a guy that finds himself, he's alone in an abandoned place somewhere down the Danube, on just an island surrounded by willows, and he has some kind of a creepy transcendent experience with the gods of the willows. And it's the dark side of the same thing that Grahame is into. If people have heard of Arthur Machen, his novel, The Great God Pan, he was a neopagan that wrote a lot of this kind of stuff. And there's all kinds of examples we could talk about. I mean, a strain of this, I'd say, runs through J.M. Barrie, runs through a lot of the children's authors of the time. Might even be like a 1% of it in the Oz books. But it is interesting. You have to place Grahame there and realize that was popular, realize that he was given to it. And then you can understand the weirdest chapter in this book, which is Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is where our characters just have an encounter, spoilers, with Pan, the nature god. And it's presented very transcendently and beautifully and romantically. And it gets at that ache towards the divine. You know, it's like C.S. Lewis's Weight of Glory. It gets at that ache towards the divine that we all have. And it's pretty just outright pagan. There's no other word for it. And boy, is that a weird chapter. I don't know what else to say about it.
It is weird. I didn't like it. I don't know. I wasn't able to enjoy, because it was worship, and it was worshiping the the creation instead of the creator.
Yeah.
Pan is just the summation of what nature is in Grahame's estimation, you know.
I thought it was well done. What he set out to do, he did very well.
He did.
I almost want to say, if you're reading it with little kids, I might just skip it. But if you're an adult who wants to take a little bit of poison in order to get the inoculation, it might be worth reading. You can understand maybe the way that people, in a more naked kind of a way than many people even today, you can understand the worship of nature. He presents it beautifully. And maybe one of the most beautiful passages like that I've read in a novel. And I say that to its shame, not to its praise. But, you know, like if you want to see somebody do nature worship well, this is about the pinnacle. Outside of some of the great horror guys, and what's good about them. What's bad about them is that they introduce an element of horror. What's good about them is they introduce an element of horror. But it is fascinating. It is fascinating in the middle of this book. It's somewhat out of character with what comes before and after, but also not really.
That's right. You're going to get neopaganism in Edith Nesbit. I think I mentioned her book. Oh, no, I just lost the title. Is it The Invisible Castle?
I believe that was a title you bandied about last time.
Well, that is very explicitly like, boy, do we miss the old Greek gods. And boy, do I have a sense of longing for them. And I want to give you, the child reader, a sense of longing for them. And she's good at that, I think. PSA, be careful for your kids. Like, even reading Caldecott's Book of Myths or whatever can give them a sense of longing for the Greek gods and goddesses in a very weird way, because we're made to worship. And at certain times in your life, especially, certain things can strike you. Certain things can strike young kids, their own longings, and fit there. And it will not be a longing for God. It'll be a longing for Apollos or Pan or something. And these stories can really successfully move your kids' emotions that way. So be careful.
You know who else is like that and comes from the same era, and I should have mentioned him already. George MacDonald is maybe a couple decades before these guys was when he was at his prime. He was writing more he died in 1905. I just looked it up. So he lived into the Edwardian era, but probably wrote most of his stuff in the late 19th century as opposed to the early 20th. But he's got this same kind of semi-Christianized pagan, like, I'm a Christian and I come from a Christian society. But the thing that I think is really cool is the fairies, and not like the fairies from some fairy tale, but like the fairies, the embodiments of the old demons and sprites and spirits that still inform our world today. So yeah, I mean, you see that strain of stuff all through the late Victorian era and into the Edwardian and then into the early 20th century. And of course, it's still with us today in various ways. But I think it had a flowering at that time that it actually didn't have again until maybe the late 1960s, and then again now, really, with neopaganism and the death of Christianity in the West. But it's interesting stuff. I mean, what the Gospel Coalition would do with the chapter Piper at the Gates of Dawn is they'd say, yes, he successfully evokes longing. And so we can just say, without knowing it, he's evoking our longing for Jesus.
Nope. I don't think so.
I mean, I have, let's say, 25% sympathy for that argument. I have 75% disdain for that argument. I have 25% in that sympathy for that argument, in that when you read, for example, in Proverbs, the description of wisdom as a type of Christ and being there, and wisdom being there for the creation of the world, you do have language that does actually evoke that sort of majesty, that sort of awe, that sort of transcendence. If you're reading it in the right frame of mind, you can feel that sort of longing. So it's not that those feelings aren't sometimes properly applied to Jesus or properly applied to, it's not that God didn't build us that to have a kind of longing that we might almost label as mystic.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean we approach it in a mystical way, and that doesn't mean that we use actual Gnostic writings or pagan writings in order to trigger those feelings. That would be like looking at pornography so that you can then go to bed with your wife. Like, I'm so erotically deadened that the only way I can go to bed with my wife is by looking at pornography first. Well, that's not a healthy place to be in your marriage. And if the only way that you can feel any feelings of worship or veneration for your actual creator is by approaching him through derivations and permutations and perversions, approaching him through myths and idols, then that ain't going to get you anywhere. So F- for the Gospel Coalition and their ilk, as usual. Anything else to say about the wind in the willows?
Let's see. No, I don't think so. We could talk more about the animal-human divide.
Let's talk about
or
it.
lack of it. Well, what else is there to say? It's not very clearly drawn. I don't know that it hurts the book. It did make me, like you, ask certain questions during the Mr. Toad scene, especially like, what is the size of Mr. Toad relative to the human beings? Because it seems like he's actually on a parity, size-wise. He's the size of a human woman, a washerwoman, as we learn.
Right.
And are all the other animals that size? So you start asking these questions that actually pull you out of the story.
Yeah, I wanted to force myself not to, because I didn't want to be pedantic.
And I was trying not to.
But yes, I felt the sort of same thing. Like, I know you're not supposed to ask. I know it's all supposed to just sort of be washed together, and who cares? And in some, it's vaguely metaphorical, vaguely not. But a little bit of clarity would have helped me, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, even something like Nem, I'm enough of a person that's like that. I don't think of myself as someone who's rigorous about like, well, how did Bruce Wayne get back to Gotham without any money in Dark Knight? Right? You know, those kinds of things. It's like, who cares? But on the other hand, it's like, I don't know. There is part of me always that's like, well, is Mrs. Frisbee, she's wearing clothes or not? Or where? Like, what are the rules here? I want to know the rules. Not because I'm obsessed with the rules, but just because tell me the rules and then I can forget about them and then enjoy the story. Whereas if I keep coming across them and being bothered by them, then I can't enjoy the story. So I don't know. F-, Wind in the Willows sucks.
There you go.
I'm trying to think of what else. I like the final confrontation, very Odyssean confrontation with the stoats.
And the weasels.
And the weasels.
And the ferrets.
And the ferret. A lot of fun. And again, just feels wildly like from a different era. Just, I mean, even just the fact that Rat is like, oh, my friend might have gone to a dangerous place. And so he grabs a brace of pistols and
a cudgel.
And it's like, who are these people? What era do they come from? What world are we living in? And then you remember your G.K. Chesterton and you're like, well, I think he's writing with that perspective. Like, you go for a walk, you take your pistol and your walking stick. You're prepared to defend yourself. And I don't know. It's a weird world. And there's also a lot of stuff about the automobile as a symbol of societal decay and newfangled, something that a dumb modern person I don't think the book's quite, I'm exaggerating. I don't think Kenneth Grahame necessarily is saying, automobile equals bad, but there is this kind of sense of encroaching modernity in the book. And it is, he's writing in 1911 when the automobile was encroaching modernity as opposed to just a fact of modernity. Well, how many willows out of 14 do you give to the Wind in the Willows?
13, I guess.
Yeah, 13 willows. Unlucky.
There you go.
Unlucky book. Do not read this book. No, I would say this is in many ways the best book that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the most fun, I would think, to read aloud with when your kids are the right age for it.
For sure.
I'd imagine they'd have to be 6, 7, 8, not real little, but I suppose you wouldn't want to read any of the books we've mentioned so far to people who were like my 2-year-old daughter.
Nope.
Wouldn't get a lot out of them.
Yeah.
If you like Frog and Toad. But this is a 13. And if you have $13 you want to give us, go to patreon.com/Sound of Sanity. Sign up today. I guess that's it. Until next time. Ben's shaking his head. He's got nothing. All right. He's getting on his computer. He's looking. He's trying to think of a quote. The wind in the willows and the silver spoon. The little boy laughs at the man in the moon. When you're coming home, I don't know when we can get together then. Until next time.
Here today, up and off to somewhere else tomorrow.